If you have type O positive blood, your DNA has a dark secret. Somewhere on a lab form, a nurse once wrote two characters next to your name and never thought about them again. O positive. To the hospital, it's a logistics code, the difference between which bag gets hung on the four-pole. But those two characters are not administrative trivia. They're the tail end of a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years, across a frozen land bridge, through plagues that erased entire cities, and into the genetic code sitting in your bloodstream right now. If your blood type is O positive, you are carrying a signature written into your DNA by ancestors who survived things most of us can't imagine. And that same signature comes with a trade-off that scientists are still trying to fully understand. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will never look at your blood type card the same way again. Let's start with how we even learned that blood types exist at all, because for the first several thousand years of human history, nobody had any idea. Doctors who attempted blood transfusions in the 1800s were essentially gambling with a patient's life. Sometimes the transfusion worked and the patient recovered. Other times, for reasons nobody could explain, the same procedure triggered violent reactions, organ failure, and death within hours. It wasn't until 1901 that an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner figured out why. He mixed blood samples from different people in his lab and noticed that some combinations blended smoothly while others caused the red blood cells to clump together into visible clusters. That clumping was the exact reaction that had been killing transfusion patients, just now visible under controlled conditions. Landsteiner realized human blood wasn't a single uniform substance. It came in distinct types, which he labeled A, B, and O, with a fourth type, a B, identified shortly after by his colleagues. This discovery is one of the reasons blood transfusions are safe today, and it eventually won Landsteiner a Nobel Prize. Here's where the story gets more interesting, though. Landsteiner and the scientists who followed him could tell the blood types apart, but they had no way of knowing which type came first in human history or why. And into that gap, early 20th century researchers made an assumption that turned out to be badly mistaken. Most of the scientists working on blood typing were based in Europe, and when they looked at their own populations, type A showed up constantly. Because it was common where they lived, they assumed it must be the original ancestral human blood type, with type O dismissed as some kind of later mutation, a biological afterthought that didn't fit neatly into the story. That idea held for decades, repeated in textbooks and lectures, simply because nobody had bothered to test it against the rest of the world. The problem is that once researchers actually started collecting blood samples globally, after World War II, through blood banks and public health surveys and expeditions to remote regions, the tidy European narrative fell apart almost immediately. If type A were really the ancestral blood type, you'd expect the oldest, most isolated human populations on Earth to be dominated by it. Instead, researchers found the opposite. Indigenous populations across North, Central, and South America, groups that have been isolated from the rest of humanity for thousands of years before European contact, turn out to carry overwhelmingly high rates of type O blood. In some communities in Central and South America, the frequency approached nearly the entire population. That is not what you'd expect from a recent, random genetic accident. A brand new mutation doesn't spread to nearly 100% of an isolated population across a continent in the available time frame. Something else had to be going on. The explanation researchers landed on is called a founder effect, and it's a fairly intuitive idea once you break it down. Imagine a small band of people, maybe a few dozen individuals, who break off from a larger population and migrate into new, unoccupied territory. Whatever genetic traits that small founding group happened to carry become the genetic baseline for every descendant that follows, sometimes for tens of thousands of years. If the founding group that first migrated into the Americas happened to carry a high proportion of type O blood, then their descendants would inherit that same pattern amplified over dozens of generations of relative isolation. In other words, the extremely high rate of type O blood across indigenous America isn't a mutation that appeared there. It's a genetic fingerprint left by the specific group of people who arrived first. So who were those founders, and where did they come from? The archaeological and genetic evidence is fairly consistent on this point. The ancestors of the first Americans didn't arrive by boat across an open ocean. They walked, crossing from Siberia into Alaska over a land bridge that existed during the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers that sea levels dropped and exposed a strip of land connecting Asia and North America. Small groups of hunter-gatherers moved across that bridge over the course of many generations, following game animals into a landmass no human had ever set foot on before. And if type O blood really did travel with them out of Asia, you would expect to still see traces of it in East Asian populations today. That's exactly what shows up in the data. Countries like the Philippines and Vietnam show notably elevated rates of type O blood compared to many other regions, a pattern consistent with an ancient reservoir of that blood type existing in the region long before recorded history. Now, here's the question that actually matters for you personally. Blood types don't spread across half the planet and persist for tens of thousands of years by accident. Traits like this usually stick around because they provide some kind of survival advantage. In the case of type O blood, researchers believe they've identified exactly what that advantage was: malaria. Malaria has been one of the deadliest forces in human history, a parasite delivered through mosquito bites that invades red blood cells and causes fever severe enough to kill within days. When researchers studied how the malaria parasite behaves inside the body, they found that infected red blood cells tend to become sticky, clumping together and forming clusters inside blood vessels that help the parasite evade the immune system. This is where type O blood behaves differently. The surface of a type O red blood cell lacks the extra molecular structures, called antigens, that are found on type A and type B cells. Multiple studies conducted in regions where malaria is endemic have found that type O carriers tend to experience milder cases of severe malaria compared to people with type A or B blood, likely because their red cells don't clump as effectively for the parasite. Over tens of thousands of years, in regions where malaria was killing a significant share of every generation, that difference in survival odds would have been more than enough to spread type O blood widely. Malaria isn't the only place where the smooth, unmarked surface of a type O red blood cell seems to have offered an advantage. Certain strains of norovirus, the extremely contagious stomach bug responsible for outbreaks on cruise ships and in schools, need to attach to specific molecules on the surface of gut cells in order to cause infection. And for a number of these strains, those molecules are the same antigens that define type A and B blood. Type O carriers don't have those particular surface molecules, meaning some strains of norovirus have a harder time gaining a foothold. It's not full immunity, and it doesn't apply to every strain, but it's a real, documented pattern in the research on norovirus susceptibility. But this is where the story stops being a straightforward tale of superior blood and starts revealing its price, because the same absence of surface antigens that helps protect against malaria and certain norovirus strains appears to work against type O carriers when it comes to other diseases. Cholera is the clearest example. The bacteria that cause cholera release a toxin that needs to bind to receptors on the intestinal wall to trigger the disease's brutal, rapid dehydration. Research conducted in regions with significant cholera outbreaks has repeatedly found that people with type O blood tend to experience more severe cases of the disease, with faster and more extreme fluid loss compared to people with other blood types. The exact biological reasoning is still being studied, but the pattern shows up consistently enough in epidemiological data that it's taken seriously by researchers working in public health. There's also research linking type O blood to a somewhat higher lifetime likelihood of developing stomach ulcers, tied to how easily a certain corkscrew-shaped stomach bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, is able to anchor itself in the gut lining. So the same molecular quirk that shielded ancient populations from one killer appears to have left them a little more exposed to others. That's not a flaw in the science. It's just how evolution actually works. It doesn't produce perfect solutions. It produces trade-offs that happen to result in more surviving descendants than the alternative. There's one more twist worth mentioning here, and it's one you can actually test on your own porch on a summer evening. Several controlled studies, including ones where researchers had volunteers place their bare arms into enclosures full of mosquitoes and simply counted the landings, have found that mosquitoes appear to be drawn to people with type O blood more often than people with other blood types. The exact mechanism, whether it's related to skin chemistry, scent, or something else entirely, isn't fully settled in the science yet, and not every study on this topic agrees on the size of the effect. But it's an interesting enough pattern that entomologists have kept studying it. And if you've ever wondered why mosquitoes seem to leave your friend alone and go straight for you at a barbecue, your blood type might be part of the answer. Before we wrap up, there's one genuinely rare medical case worth knowing about, because it shows just how much variation still exists within blood typing that most people, including most doctors, never encounter. In 1952, a patient in what was then Bombay needed a blood transfusion. Doctors matched the donor blood to type O, which is normally considered the safest, most universally compatible option. The patient's body violently rejected it anyway. It turned out this person was missing a foundational molecule called the H antigen, the base structure that all the other blood type antigens are actually built on top of. Without it, even ordinary type O blood was treated by the immune system as a foreign threat. This condition, now called the Bombay phenotype, is extraordinarily rare worldwide, found in roughly 1 in a million people, though it shows up somewhat more often in parts of India, at around 1 in 10,000. It's a reminder that even a system we think we fully understand still has edge cases science is continuing to map. So what does all of this actually mean if you're the person whose chart says O positive? It means your blood isn't just a compatibility code for the blood bank. It's carrying a genuine, measurable signature of the path your ancestors took, whether that was across the Beringia land bridge into an unpopulated continent, or through generations of surviving malaria outbreaks in the tropics. It also comes with a couple of practical, well-documented physiological differences. People with type O blood tend to have somewhat lower levels of certain clotting factors circulating in their bloodstream, which is linked to a modestly lower risk of certain dangerous blood clots, but also means wounds may take slightly longer to stop bleeding. None of this is destiny, and blood type is just one small piece of a much larger picture when it comes to your health, but it is a real, quantifiable piece of biology that traces back further than written history itself. For 100 years, scientists assumed type O was the leftover, the mutation, the blood type that didn't quite belong in the main story of human evolution. It took a global map, built one blood sample at a time for populations that had been ignored by early researchers, to reveal that the truth ran in the opposite direction. Type O wasn't a footnote. It might be one of the oldest, most battle-tested blood signatures our species has ever carried, forged by fevers, floods, and a walk across a bridge of ice that no longer exists. So here's what I want to know from you. If your blood type is O positive, did anyone ever tell you there was a story behind it, or was it just a line on a form until today? Let me know in the comments. And if there's another piece of everyday biology you want to explain like this, tell me what it is, because there's always another story hiding in plain sight.